I was thinking about the Irish language and how it might be better, for the moment, not to fully revive it. Under normal circumstances, of course, a people should speak the language of their forebears, and not a foreign import, but we are not under normal circumstances. I do not think that anyone denies that if a group exists, then it has a right to continue to exist, or at least a right to attempt to continue to exist. Thus, a lot of rhetoric is used, not to deny these rights, but to deny that certain groups, white groups, exist at all. If a group is separate from its neighbors, then what sets it apart? Genetics is one. The rhetoric will say that any group is a mix of other groups, and thus there is no real genetic distinction. Plus, the average person is not au fait with genetics or their significance. Culture is another aspect, but the rhetoric would claim, again, that a culture is a mix of foreign imports, and that an outsider could adopt a culture, so that is not a lasting distinction. Values is one about which we hear a lot. A group's values could set it apart from its neighbors, but the rhetoric will define the values to be so broad that the foreigner holds them as much as the native, and sometimes more. Language is another aspect, and perhaps the most powerful. People understand language unlike genetics. Language is not a universal thing that the outsider speaks, unlike with the values. Language is a stark difference between groups. I do not know off the top of my head why Portugal and Spain are different, but I know that they must be, since they speak different languages. Of course, a Spaniard could learn Portuguese and become Portuguese, right? Maybe in this case, but this is where Irish is different. Language is how we communicate, but it is also an ancestral inheritance. We speak it because our parents did, and their parents, and so on. With most languages, this inheritance is invisible. Everyone speaks Portuguese in Portugal now, and it was the same 50 years ago, and another 50, and so on. Even though Portuguese has evolved over time, and the people have lived, died, and were born, there has been no relative change in this regard. Imagine a graph with an x-axis and a y-axis, but f of x is a constant. For any value of x, y is the same. For any year that I enter Portugal, the use of Portuguese is the same. If your family has been in Portuguese for 200 years, and I just arrived, but we both speak Portuguese, then we are both at the same height along the graph, and have both observed the same change in y, no change at all. But what about Irish? It is not how we communicate in Ireland. We can, and often do, but not in general. This raises the obvious question of why not. Now we enter the ancestral inheritance. An outsider simply cannot integrate into it. You cannot integrate or assimilate into the past. If I go to America, then I could impersonate an American, but my family did not fight in Vietnam or in the Civil War. I will always be apart from those Americans who did. With the Irish language, the outsider will always be separate. To return to our graph, the Irish language was the language of the people, then it was taken away, then it was rescued, and now it limps on today. 100% of people had it in the past, today maybe 30%. There has been a change in why, and now it does matter if you were here for 200 years or just arrived. Thus the Irish language, in its weakened state, serves as a reminder of who the Irish people were, and therefore sets them apart as a group. Now they can have the confidence to secure their existence, regardless of the rhetoric. If the Irish language were fully restored, then it would become a medium for communication first, and ancestral inheritance second, like with Portuguese, and would not set the Irish people apart like it does now. Equally, if it were to die out completely, then we would be left with just the English language, like with just the Portuguese language. Irish for the moment can only afford to limp on in its weakened state, unfortunately, but probably better in the longer term.